Good afternoon and welcome to the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership webinar on the development of dissolved oxygen, temperature, and nutrient thresholds to protect cold water fish species in Minnesota lakes by Bouchard and Bahr. I'm Joe Noner, the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership Coordinator, and I'll share a little bit of information about the partnership and logistics for the webinar before we get started with our presentation. Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership, or MGLP, hosts these lake conservation webinars to share science, management, and outreach efforts of interest to our partners. You can keep up to date with our webinars by checking out the webinar page at midwestglaciallakes.org. Webinars in the series will be added to our webpage alongside other webinars of interest, with about 20 webinars this year. I really encourage you to check those out. Notifications for the webinars will also be provided through the MGLP's quarterly newsletter, which you can sign up for at our website. If you'd like to share your experience of research, management, or conservation, or your project results through a webinar like this, please reach out to me. My email address is listed on the screen now. It's nohnerj@michigan.gov. We're always looking for more folks to tell their stories because we're all dealing with the same problems across the upper Midwest with our lakes. For those of you unfamiliar with the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership, we're a partnership of professionals and stakeholders focused on conserving the over 40,000 glacially formed inland lakes across an 8-state region in the upper Midwest. Our mission is to protect, rehabilitate, and enhance sustainable fish habitats in the glacial lakes of the Midwest for the use and enjoyment of current and future generations. The partnership provides three main things. One, science for lake conservation, such as our conservation planner. It provides a little bit of information about every lake in the partnership. Education and outreach to stakeholders and professionals through these webinars, news releases, Twitter conversations, and the sharing of materials related to lake conservation, such as our shoreline living document, which you can order now on our website, and funding for science, outreach, and education, and on-the-ground rehabilitation projects through our lake conservation grant. The grant is released every year and provides about $300,000 for lake conservation projects that benefit fishes, including structural habitat, water quality, education and outreach, and assessments. That request for proposals is open right now with a due date of May 7th. So if you have any questions or think you might have a project that would be a good fit, again, please reach out to me. Logistics for today's webinar. The presentation should last about 30 or 45 minutes and we'll hold the remaining time for questions. Participants will be muted during the webinar, so if you have any questions, please use the question and answer function to submit them. Simply hover your screen over the presentation, and at the bottom in the middle, you should see a Q&A button. Click on that Q&A button and you can submit your questions into the Q&A function. I'll moderate those questions and make sure that we try to get to them all. If for some reason you have technical difficulties or you'd like to share this webinar with others that couldn't attend, we'll post a video to the webinars page of our website within a week or so. So today's speakers are Will Bouchard and Bahr. Will received his MA in entomology from the University of Kansas and his PhD in entomology from the University of Minnesota. He was an adjunct professor at Hamline University and a postdoctoral researcher at the Academy of Natural Sciences at Drexel University before he became a research scientist at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency in 2008. His work at the MPCA includes coordinating the implementation of tiered aquatic life uses framework, review of beneficial use designations, and the development of water quality standards to protect aquatic biota. Derek is a research scientist with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. His work currently focuses on fisheries habitat in lakes, including ongoing implementation and evaluation of fish-based indexes of biological integrity sampling in lakes, evaluation of relationships between fish and shoreline habitat, and the coordination and development of water quality standards to protect cold water species. Previous work has included evaluating recapture rates of muskies using vertical gill net and hydroacoustic sampling gears to evaluate Cisco populations. Originally a Wisconsin native, he received his BS in fisheries from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and went on to complete his master's at the University of Georgia, focused on sturgeon and Georgia rivers. He's had a strong interest in the connection between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, likely stemming from his upbringing on a dairy farm and the countless hours spent fishing on local lakes. So, introductions complete. I will now turn over the controls to Derek and Will, and I look forward to your presentation.
All right, thanks, Joe. we'll just dive right into it here. So first, I'll provide a quick overview for anyone that might be unfamiliar with Minnesota's cold water fishes. So along with other states in the partnership, Minnesota is home to several native cold water fishes, including lake trout, lake whitefish, Cisco, and burbot. Of these 4 species, burbot have the broadest distribution across major watersheds, as can be seen by the distribution maps, with green indicating major watersheds where the species is native. But burbot are also fairly cryptic and difficult to sample using traditional fisheries survey gears, so less is known about the species. So in addition to these 4 species, several stream trout species such as native brook trout and non-native brown trout and rainbow trout, and several non-game species such as deepwater sculpin are also present in lakes across Minnesota. For the remainder of this presentation, we'll be focusing on lake trout, lake whitefish, and Cisco. And of these 3 species, lake trout have the most stringent habitat requirements in terms of summer water temperature and oxygen, followed by lake whitefish and Cisco. I'll be further describing this in the next few slides. So as I mentioned, cold water fish require specific habitat conditions to survive. As implied, they are dependent on cold, oxygenated water, which can become limited during the summer months. So I've included an example of a somewhat typical summer temperature dissolved oxygen profile from a stratified lake here to illustrate. In this example, the water temperature at the surface is warmer than the preferred temperature range of Cisco, and the dissolved oxygen at the bottom of the lake is below the preferred range. However, there's a fairly large layer of water that is cool enough with sufficient dissolved oxygen to support Cisco in this lake during the summer. The TDO3, which we'll be talking about throughout this presentation, a single variable that represents temperature at a benchmark oxygen concentration of 3 parts per million, is also low at 6.1 degrees Celsius and indicates suitable oxythermal habitat is present in this lake. In this example here, the water column is either too warm or lacks dissolved oxygen sufficient for Cisco. The TDO3 value is also much higher at 22.1 degrees Celsius. So now that we're hopefully more familiar with TDO3 as a measure of oxythermal habitat, I'll describe some of the previous work by Jacobson et al. 2010 that characterizes the oxythermal habitat in lakes where each of lake trout, lake whitefish, and Cisco have been documented. The box plot on the left shows average summer maximum TDO3 in degrees Celsius relative to cold water species presence denoted by a P or absence denoted by an A. The median, interquartile ranges, and reasonable extremes are displayed for lakes where each species has been documented compared with lakes where these species are not found, but that are also stratified in the same major basins. The plot illustrates that there are differences in oxythermal habitats where each of the 3 cold water species are found. Of the 3, lake trout are generally found in the coolest waters with TDO3 values less than 8 degrees Celsius. Cisco, on the other hand, are the most euthermal of the species. The plot on the right is a generalized additive model fitted regression that illustrates the probability of occurrence of each of the 3 species as a function of average summer maximum TDO3. So as TDO3 increases, the probability of occurrence declines for each of the species. Now, as you might imagine, several threats exist to lake trout, lake whitefish, and Cisco populations throughout their range. Eutrophication, or excess nutrients, and climate change can directly impact available oxythermal habitat in lakes. Eutrophication can result in depletion of dissolved oxygen in the hypolimnion as a result of increased rates of organic material decomposition and decay, forcing cold water species to move up into warmer or mixed waters that contain sufficient dissolved oxygen. Climate change can lead to extended periods of summer stratification and warming of surface waters. The combination of these factors can contribute to a habitat squeeze that leads to physiological stress and summer kill events. So the plot in the shown here is modified from Jacobson et al. 2010, and it illustrates the effects of several variables, including total phosphorus and mean July air temperature on TDO3. Increases in both variables are related to increases in TDO3. Aquatic invasive species such as rainbow smelt can also negatively affect lake trout, lake whitefish, and Cisco, as they have been documented to prey on larval cold water fishes, directly compete for food resources, and create diamine deficiencies in species that feed on them. Now we'll drill down specifically into the effects of nutrients on oxythermal habitat in stratified lakes. So this plot depicts the overall relationship between TDO3 and total phosphorus. It includes all stratified lakes in Minnesota where temperature oxygen profiles have been taken. So a few general observations to point out include the dramatic increase or decrease, in TDO3 or oxythermal habitat as total phosphorus increases from approximately 5 to 25 parts per billion, and the leveling off that occurs at total phosphorus levels exceeding 25 parts per billion. Those lakes with total phosphorus levels exceeding 25 parts per billion essentially offer little to no cold water refuge during the peak of the summer and are problematic from a cold water fish protection standpoint when land use changes are contributing to increases in nutrient levels in many lakes. Since I've outlined several of the prominent stressors to cold water fishes, I'll now briefly go over the current protections that exist for lakes in Minnesota. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, in collaboration with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and the Department of Health, has developed and implemented water quality standards for the state. These standards, which include biological criteria, nutrient criteria, and criteria for several chemicals, cover several beneficial use classes, including aquatic life use, aquatic recreation use, and aquatic consumption use. Lakes that are assessed as impaired based on these standards undergo formal stressor identification and TMDL processes and are included in restoration planning efforts. Additionally, the Minnesota DNR, MPCA, and others have been involved in developing several lists to aid in prioritization of protection-related activities. So these include a list of Cisco refuge lakes, or lakes that are identified as being deep and clear enough to provide suitable cold water fish habitat even after significant climate warming, lakes of biological significance, or lakes identified as exhibiting the highest quality features within any of 4 biological communities, including aquatic plants, fish, birds, and amphibians, and lakes of phosphorus sensitivity. So these lists and others are used when prioritizing land acquisitions, for example, with the emphasis on maintaining healthy watersheds surrounding these important lakes. For more information specific to Cisco refuge lakes and watershed protection activities that are currently taking place in Minnesota, check out the archived MGLP webinar from April 6th titled Protecting Cold Water Fish Habitat in Minnesota Lakes, presented by Pete Jacobson. So though I've outlined several great approaches that Minnesota uses to protect water quality, these protections may not be fully sufficient to protect oxythermal habitat for Minnesota's primary cold water fishes. For example, standards intended to protect aquatic life use, as determined based on Fish Index of Biological Integrity, or Fish IBI scores, sufficiently characterize overall fish community health, but may not fully protect cold water species and their habitat needs specifically. One limitation is that fish IBIs have not been developed for certain lake types. These lakes are depicted in the map as light blue, whereas lakes that are suitable to be evaluated using fish IBIs are depicted as black. Many of the light blue lakes are found in the Canadian Shield or are too large or too small for the fish IBI to be appropriate. For lakes where the fish IBI is appropriate and a cold water community is present, only a single metric out of either 11 or 15 metrics in the fish IBI is geared towards intolerant cool and cold water species. Finally, as the figure illustrates, impairment based on the fish IBI often corresponds with total phosphorus levels that exceed the 25 parts per billion level that I had previously described. So many of these lakes might not be identified as impaired until oxythermal habitat, and thus the cold water fish species that it supports has already been lost. Water quality standards intended to protect aquatic recreation use may also not fully protect oxythermal habitat requirements of cold water fishes, and in particular, Cisco and Lake Whitefish populations in lakes in either the Northern Lakes and Forests, or NLF, or the North Central Hardwood Forests, or NCHF, ecoregions. As the table illustrates, the total phosphorus standards in these ecoregions are 30 and 40 parts per billion respectively, and both are higher than the 25 parts per billion level at which hypoamnitic oxygen is often depleted in stratified lakes. It's largely because of these limitations that the MPCA and DNR have prioritized developing a list of cold water lakes and additional standards to be used to provide further protection. Others, such as the Environmental Protection Agency and various state agencies, including Wisconsin DNR, have also recognized that current standards may not be sufficient and are therefore working on developing criteria to address these possible gaps in protections for cold water species. So now that I've shared some of the background on the habitat needs of these species, as well as the limitations of current water quality standards to protect oxythermal habitat needed by them. I'll describe the process I used to inventory Minnesota's lakes that support these species. So the first step was data consolidation. I started by gathering all electronically available survey data that had been collected by the Minnesota DNR to date. So this included records going back as far as the 1940s in some cases. I also gathered all electronically available temperature oxygen profile data collected by the DNR and MPCA, which I would later use to help evaluate stratification and also calculate TDO3 values. I used the fish survey information to assemble an initial list of lakes where each of the species had been sampled at least once. Ideally, vertical gill netting would have been used to sample pelagic cold water fish communities statewide. However, that experimental gear type has only been used to sample a relatively small subset of the lakes to date. Therefore, I primarily used standard gill net data to construct the lists and vertical gill net data as supporting information where it was available. I sent the species lists to area fisheries managers for their review and asked for additional input regarding extirpation events, stocking history, whether individuals sampled were suspected transients from connected water bodies with robust resident populations, whether there was a suspected data entry error or misidentification, and various other questions. Responses helped to better categorize lakes and further refine the list that would benefit from additional protections. The feedback also allowed us to conduct follow-up surveys, generally using vertical gill nets, where data was lacking or where traditional gears such as standard gill nets did not effectively sample the pelagic areas of the lakes. Because of the effects of nutrients on oxythermal habitat are most apparent in stratified lakes, we sought to separate our cold water lakes list to those that likely stratify during the summer and those that are mixed. As temperature oxygen profiles were not available for all lakes on the list, we determined that we would need to use a surrogate to initially categorize all lakes. We used geometry ratio, calculated as the lake's surface area to the 0.25 divided by the maximum depth, and determined based on the literature and a comparison between geometry ratio and stratification where profile data was available, that a geometry ratio of less than 4 would be used for the initial characterization. So the plot on the right illustrates that for lakes where profile data was available, a majority of lakes that experienced greater than a 1 degree Celsius per meter change were correctly classified as stratified using the geometry ratio approach. We're also interested in establishing minimum sample requirements for including a lake on the cold water list to reduce the likelihood of including lakes that would not naturally support resident populations of cold water species or where sufficient information for determination was lacking. We used a classification tree approach to help determine suitable criteria, which resulted in inclusion of lakes where at least 2 standard gillnet surveys had captured the species and where at least 10 individuals of that species had been sampled across surveys. We did allow for professional judgment to be used to justify inclusion of lakes that did not meet the initial criteria. So one example would be Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness Lakes, where only 1 survey had ever been conducted due to the difficulty accessing the lake, but where numerous individuals were sampled and area fisheries staff exhibited high confidence in the species status. Another example was lakes that had additional non-standard gillnet catch data, such as vertical gillnet data or ice out trap net data that supported the standard gillnet catch data. Using the classification schemes outlined in the previous slide, we were able to construct detailed statewide lake inventories for lake trout, lake whitefish, and Cisco. Lake trout have been documented in a total of 217 lakes in Minnesota. Of those 217, 108 are being proposed for additional protections based on meeting minimal sampling requirements at this time. Many lakes where lake trout were documented but excluded were those that were stocked in the early 1900s, but populations never became established. Lake whitefish have been documented in a total of 159 lakes after excluding 19 where misidentification was suspected. And of those 159, 103 are being considered for additional protection based on meeting those minimum sampling requirements. And 89 are classified as stratified, while 14 are classified as mixed. Cisco have been documented in a total of 693 lakes after excluding 5 where misidentification was suspected. And of those 693, 552 are considered for additional protections based on meeting minimum sampling requirements. So 501 are classified as stratified, while 51 are classified as mixed. So in total, 849 lakes in Minnesota had records of lake trout, lake whitefish, and/or Cisco. Of those, 584 were categorized as stratified and as having sufficient survey data to designate for one or more cold water species. Likewise, 61 were categorized as mixed and as having sufficient survey data to designate. Many lakes that would be proposed as Lake Whitefish or Cisco lakes are found in the NLF or NCHF ecoregions, the area of the state that currently has nutrient standards of 30 to 40 parts per billion total phosphorus. Many of the other lakes containing lake trout, lake whitefish, or Cisco are found in the Canadian Shield or the northeast part of the state where the fish IBI tool has not been developed to evaluate them. So collectively, hundreds of lakes would benefit from additional protection if they were designated as cold water lakes, and subsequently water quality standards were developed that specifically protected the oxythermal habitat needed by the species. So without these protections, and with increases in stressors such as eutrophication and climate change, many of these communities may be vulnerable. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Will, and he'll continue this presentation.
All right, let's see. Oh, I think I did that. Having trouble turning on my video here. Well, I guess if I can't turn it on, I can't turn it on. But anyway, so that's next I lead into what I'm going to talk about, which is how we planned it. What I'm going to focus on is water quality standards, developing water quality standards to protect these fish, and specifically developing dissolved oxygen, temperature, and nutrient thresholds for these three fish species: Cisco, lake whitefish, and lake trout. So, like Derek said, we have lake eutrophication standards on the books right now, and part of those standards is to protect cold water fish species. But those standards are focused on lakes that support trout. So they're either lake trout lakes or they're managed for stream trout. And so there are more stringent standards, total phosphorus, chlorophyll-a, secchi-depth standards to protect those lakes. But there's a lot of lakes in the state, like Derek was talking about, that are Cisco or lake whitefish only lakes, lakes that don't have trout in them, that would basically fall under Minnesota's warm water lake standards. And, you know, just like Derek was saying, you know, a lot of those lakes are going to have standards that may not be protective to you know, support these sensitive and important species. So, you know, part of what we wanted to do is, again, review our standards and determine if our current standards are going to be sufficient to protect these fish species. So this is a logistic regression plot. Basically, you know, what's the probability that a lake is going to support Cisco as a function of that TDO3 measure, that oxythermal measurement? Does it have enough oxygen and to support these fish species, and is there enough, or is the temperature low enough? And so what you can see here, this matches, you know, some of the plots that Derek was showing, the work by Pete Jacobson. You know, basically, you know, this species is going to decline along that gradient of TDO3, and in particular, with this updated data, it really looks like when you get above about 21 degrees Celsius TDO3, that those populations really drop out, or the likelihood that a lake is going to support Cisco really drops off. As we'd expect, the lake whitefish also have a negative relationship, and they appear to be more sensitive. There's many fewer lakes, but again, there's a negative relationship between the probability of a lake supporting lake whitefish and this TDO3 measure. And then finally, the lake trout, which are the most stenothermic species, they drop off, you know, almost immediately. We don't see many lakes with a TDO3 above 8 supporting lake trout. So, you know, this backs up the previous research. There's nothing surprising, you know, in regards to the sensitivity of these fish species, but we start to see, well, you know, maybe there's some thresholds that we can use from this information. This is just comparing those three species again. Again, lake trout are the most sensitive, followed by the lake whitefish, and then the Cisco. The other thing that we were looking at is, can we get some abundance or catch per unit effort information from these standard GILDNet surveys? As Derek mentioned, these standard gill net surveys are not ideal for sampling these cold water fish. These nets are usually placed at or above the thermocline, and so they're not going to do a great job of sampling them. The mesh on the nets may not be large enough to catch some of these dwarf Cisco, and so it's not as good a method as those vertical gill nets. But if we look at the relationship between the average catch per net and this TDO3 metric, there is a negative relationship which you would expect. So although there's a lot of scatter in this, and you have lakes that have low TDO3 that have low catch numbers, there is in general, particularly when you fit this with a 90th percentile quantile regression, a negative relationship with this average catch per net metric, indicating that maybe we can use some of this information in setting standards so that we can give some credit for these lakes that have a high abundance as measured through these standard gill net surveys. This is a same analysis, but this is using those vertical gill net surveys. So these are good at capturing these fish species, and we see a similar relationship. So again, that backs up that although those standard gill net surveys are not ideal, there's still information that we can use, particularly when we're looking at them at a population level. You probably wouldn't want to say too much about an individual lake, but at a population level, we can use some of that catch per unit effort information with the standard development. And so that's what's used with these cumulative distribution functions. These are abundance weighted cumulative distribution functions. And so from these, we can calculate a 90th percentile or 90% extirpation value, or an XC90. And so basically this is the TDO3 below which 90% of the fish were captured in our database. So for Cisco, a TDO3 of 21, 90% of the fish are captured below that threshold. For Lake Whitefish, it's 17, and for Lake Trout, it's 8. And these sort of match up with what we were maybe visualizing with those logistic regressions that I showed you earlier. We can do the same analyses with chlorophyll-a. And again, there's a negative relationship with chlorophyll-a. So this is similar to total phosphorus. It's just a more proximate indicator of the productivity of the system and the likelihood that it's there's sort of productivity that might result in oxygen depletion in the hypolimnion. So Cisco, Lake Whitefish, Lake Trout, they all have a negative relationship with chlorophyll-a. And then we can identify thresholds again using those XC90 analyses. And for Cisco, that threshold is 9. For Lake Whitefish, it's 7, and Lake Trout, it's 3 micrograms per liter. So we've got a couple of suites of thresholds, preliminary criteria maybe that we could use for protecting these fish species. We've got TDO3 values, they differ for each of these 3 species. We've got chlorophyll-a. So the TDO3 is very nice because that's that oxythermal habitat. It gets at both the temperature and the oxygen, the productivity that's going to negatively impact these fish species. So it's going to be both sensitive to cultural eutrophication as well as climate change impacts. The chlorophyll-a is not going to be as sensitive to the temperature aspect of it, but it will give us a measure of the productivity in the system and whether or not it could be leading to hypolimnitic oxygen depletion. And the other thing is it fits in with our existing framework, which has that suite of total phosphorus, chlorophyll-a, and Secchi depth. Now, of course, right here, I don't have total phosphorus or Secchi depth, but we can model those from some statewide data sets that we have to determine, what's the total phosphorus that we need to target in order to hit that chlorophyll-a target. So these are 90th percentile quantile regressions for these statewide data sets. We can interpolate, for example, if we want to maintain 9 micrograms per liter in a lake, we interpolate that to about 21 micrograms per liter total phosphorus. It's not that different from the 25 that Derek was talking about. But basically what this means is, for a population of lakes that have a total phosphorus of 21, 90% of those lakes are going to meet that standard of 9 micrograms per liter. So it should be a fairly protective target. So most of the lakes, if we can at least get them to that 21 or lower, should have a low enough chlorophyll-a to protect Cisco in this example. Secchi depth is a little bit different. Secchi depth is used as a indicator of chlorophyll-a. So it's more important when we don't have enough chlorophyll-a data. And Secchi depth is nice because you can collect a lot of that data cheaply. We have volunteers collecting that information. And again, we can interpolate a a Secchi depth value from that chlorophyll-a of 9. In this case, it would be 1.8. And what this means is, for lakes that have a Secchi depth of 1.8, 90% of those are going to exceed that 9 micrograms per liter of chlorophyll-a, and so they should likely be listed. So we've got these two indicators that are useful. The Secchi depth is used as a surrogate. The total phosphorus is useful because this is really the currency for all the management that we do, for permittings, for TMDLs, for all kinds of planning that where we're going to try to reduce the culture eutrophication in these lakes in order to protect these fish species. So we can fill out that full suite of eutrophication metrics for Minnesota. So we've got total phosphorus, chlorophyll-a, Secchi depth, as well as that TDO3. So how does this compare with our current standards? Of course, we can't compare the TDO3 because we don't have any of those on the books yet, but we do have chlorophyll-a. So for Lake Trout lakes, the standard that currently applies to those lakes is 3 micrograms per liter. That's the number that we came up with through these analyses. So it's nice to see that the work that was done over a decade ago is basically supported by these new analyses using new data. The Lake Whitefish and the Cisco lakes, the standard that applies to them depends on which part of the state. Are they in the north, the northern lakes and forest region, or are they in the central region, the central hardwood forest ecoregion? And so if they're in the central region, a 14 would apply. If they're in the north, a 9 would apply. So for Lake Whitefish, neither of those standards are sufficiently protective for Lake Whitefish, which should be at about 7. For Cisco, it's mixed. If you're in the central region, that's current standard is too high. In the north, it's just about right. So there's sort of a mixed bag depending on which species we're talking about or where we are in the state. But what this means is that there are lakes that don't have sufficient standard to protect them just based on this chlorophyll-a. So based on this list of lakes that Derek was talking about, there's 71 Lake Whitefish lakes that are not also Lake Trout lakes, which already have sufficiently stringent standards to protect those Lake Whitefish. So these are 71 lakes that either need to go from 9 or 14 micrograms per liter chlorophyll-a down to 7 in order to protect those fish. For Cisco, there's 99 Cisco lakes in the central region that don't have some other more stringent standard that already applies or would apply. So those would need to go from 14 down to 9 for this chlorophyll-a standard. So depending on how the final list of lakes shakes out, we've got about 170 lakes that would benefit from having more protective standards. Just putting these in the context of the list of lakes that we have right now, there's 501 Cisco lakes. About 16% of those either exceed either the chlorophyll-a, the TDO3, or both of those preliminary thresholds that I've showed you. With the Lake Whitefish, it's 8%, and with Lake Trout, it's 6%. So Lake Whitefish and Lake Trout lakes seem to be doing pretty well. A lot of those lakes we don't have any data for, and that's because a lot of them are in remote areas, like the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. So we could assume that many of those are probably doing okay, at least in terms of impacts from anthropogenic eutrophication. Climate change, those lakes may be at more and more risk over time. The Cisco are the lakes that are at the most risk. There's many more of these lakes in the central part of the state where there's a lot more landscape disturbance. And so, they're more widespread, they're more likely to be encountering, a lot of human activity and potentially, have these lakes degraded to the point where they won't be able to support these fish any longer. So in addition to developing these standards, the other big part of this is, how do you implement this within a water quality standards framework? How do you do assessment? How do you implement assessments and use designations for these lakes? And so there's a number of things that we're working through right now, and we're pretty comfortable with some of these thresholds. We're pretty close on those, but then comes the work of actually figuring out how you implement this so that you're making the right management decisions for the protection of these lakes. And so there's issues like natural conditions. There's lakes that have unusual lake morphology. There's a number of lakes that have naturally high trophic state. There's some lakes that have in-lake cold water refugia, flowage lakes. So, some of these lakes, we may need to develop a site-specific standard to take into account these natural conditions that make them different from the larger population that was used to develop the standards, or we may need to reconsider the designation. Derek talked about some of these lakes where, the fish are transient, and so it may not be appropriate to designate, lakes where there aren't really resident populations of those species. Sampling variability, getting a handle on how many years of data we need. What are the circumstances when we're going to recommend additional monitoring or some other supplemental data in order to make a decision on whether or not a lake is meeting or not meeting. What do we do when indicators disagree? What happens if the chlorophyll-a says it's impaired, but the TDO3 says it's not? Is a TDO3 more important because that gives you a more proximate measure of the habitat within that lake, whereas the chlorophyll-a is a little bit removed from that. So do we prioritize these different indicators? How do we implement that within a standard? And then finally, Derek mentioned these polymictic or mixed lakes that have these cold water fish. It's a relatively small proportion of the lakes in the state that support these fish species, but we're not quite sure what to do with them yet, because these thresholds that I've gone through right now, most of these polymictic lakes, they don't meet those standards. There's something different going on with these lakes, and unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of them, which makes it more difficult to develop thresholds. So these are something that we're still struggling with. We want to be able to protect these lakes, but we haven't quite figured out how to do that yet. So just to wrap up here, we've got some preliminary thresholds for TDO3 and chlorophyll-a, and then of course model the total phosphorus and Secchi depth from those chlorophyll-a values. They indicate that we do have quite a few lakes, at least about 170 that don't have protective standards. In addition to that, we don't have something like an oxythermal habitat standard, something like the TDO3 to really measure directly if there's sufficient habitat, cold water habitat, for these fish species to survive. And so if we can include this into our standards, I think it should improve the effectiveness of our water quality standards for these species. So right now, where we've got these thresholds where I think we're zeroing in on where those numbers should be for their protection. We're developing those implementation procedures like I talked about, as well as trying to finalize those lists of lakes that should be protected for these fish species. Hopefully we can get to formal rulemaking sometime in 2022 with adoption most likely in 2023, but things never go quite the way you hope. But anyway, that's our target right now. So with that, I'll just say thank you. There's Derek's contact information, my contact information if you want to get hold of us outside of this webinar. Also just want to thank, there's a number of DNR and PCA scientists that have been working on this, and so it wouldn't have been able to be completed without their assistance. So I think we got plenty of time for discussion or comments. So I'll turn it back to you, Joe.
Okay, thanks, Derek and Will. A lot of information there, and really neat. For me, I sit in Michigan, and I think a lot about how we might do similar, accomplish similar goals in Michigan, and so there's a lot to digest for me personally, I know, and I imagine others are thinking the same. I'll encourage folks, if you have questions, please submit the questions through the Q&A function. Again, you can hover over your screen, and there's an icon there right in the middle of your screen in the bottom there. So please submit your questions. I don't see any now, so the stage is yours to ask questions. I have a few questions for these guys, though, to get us started. Before I do get us started, I'll just remind folks, if you take off during the Q&A session, we will be we did record this presentation, and we will be posting it on the website in about a week or so. And I do encourage you to check back in with the MGLP webinars as they move forward. So, so that said, one of the questions I had was, you guys use the 90% regressions as you translate from TDO3 to chlorophyll-a to Secchi. And I was curious whether there's a loss of protectiveness as you make each of those translations and lose a 10% of the 10% of the population of lakes as you go from one to the other. And so maybe I'm misunderstanding exactly how you did that, but I guess the question is it just as protective if you're measuring it with Secchi as it is with the TDO3?
Well, with a Secchi, no. The Secchi is that 10th percentile is basically selected so we don't make a false positive error. So we don't list things. I mean, that's one of the issues with the Secchi depth is it's cheap, it's easy to collect, but it's sometimes you don't want to be listing things without being really confident that it's impaired. But you raise a good point about so that we're using the 90th percentile for determining the threshold for chlorophyll-a, or those XC90s, and then again a 90th percentile going from the chlorophyll-a to the total phosphorus. There may be some accumulation of reduced protection, but using the 90th percentile is better than what we've been doing, because in the past we've just thrown a least squares regression and said, well, that's good enough. And I think some of the work that US EPA has been doing on their draft lake eutrophication standards are similar, and that you're developing a chlorophyll-a threshold based on the probability of exceedance. Usually you're trying to minimize that probability, and then you're extrapolating that to a total phosphorus value. And so I'm not sure there's any good way to get around it. But I think, using that 90th percentile is going to be pretty protective. I don't think there's going to be many lakes. And in fact, looking at some of these lakes, there's some lakes where you say, well, these things have a pretty good Cisco population, even though they exceed the chlorophyll-a. So, that's the problem is that there's just a lot of diversity in these lakes. Is you're trying to develop a one size fits all for all these lakes, and they're all a little bit different. So trying to minimize missing impairments, but balancing out making too many errors and on the other side of the ledger. And I think we're erring on the side of more protection here anyway.
Yeah, thanks. And it sounds like a good approach to me. So,
good question.
We had a question from the audience. Does Minnesota have a separate cold water lake dissolved oxygen standard? And if so, how does this compare to that standard?
We do. It is 7 milligrams per liter, and we never assess it because where do you measure 7 milligrams per liter? You can measure it on the surface water, and most of the lakes would probably meet that, but it's not a useful measure. So the cold water standard is really more useful for streams. And technically it applies to lakes, but no, we don't really have a usable dissolved oxygen standard for lakes right now. So this would fill that gap. But then it would raise the question, do we need something for the warm water standards as well? And I don't know. It may be that we do need some protection for, protecting hypolimnetic oxygen, but of course the species in a warm water lake are not going to be as sensitive to it. So that's maybe for a revision down the road, but one thing at a time.
Have you made similar considerations for cool water species?
Not yet. I've done some preliminary analyses looking at relationships, these oxythermal habitat relationships with things like smallmouth bass and walleye, and they don't seem to be very responsive to it. Unless it gets really nasty. As long as there's enough oxygen in that thermocline and above, they seem like they're doing okay. But I'm not a fisheries biologist. It's just me crunching a few numbers and not really seeing anything that jumps out at me is really needing to target the protection of hypolimnetic oxygen to protect some of those cooler water species.
We had another question. What was the total number of lakes with one or more of the 3 species that had been extirpated to date? And how many of those were due to the thermocline level increasing with the hypolimnion less than 3 parts per million oxygen, making up the majority of the water column during the summer months?
That one's probably for me. I guess we don't have a specific number pinned down for that. I could look through the data and see some of the challenges like Will alluded to, where that some of the lakes that are kind of on this southern extent of the range, for example, are some of our more highly connected lakes. And so you might think you have an extirpated population, but then all of a sudden a few fish will pop up, and whether they're fish that are moving through from some connected system that's upstream that has more sufficient oxythermal habitat, that's kind of a question to be determined. So I would say there are certainly a handful of smaller isolated lakes where we can fairly confidently say that they've been extirpated due to eutrophication or climate change or the combination. But we also have a handful of lakes that they've likely been extirpated due to rainbow smelt introductions too. So that's kind of another piece to the puzzle.
And I mean, since this is going to be a Clean Water Act standard, one of the things we're trying to figure out is when these things were extirpated. And so there's that existing use consideration. So if they were extirpated after 1975, then November 28th, 1975, then those are lakes that we'd probably still put on the list, even though they don't currently support, or they may not be restorable. But Clean Water Act says, well, that's an existing use and you've got to protect it. So that's one of the things that we're going through and trying to come up with these final lists of lakes.
All right, shifting gears a little bit, for lakes that don't meet this threshold, what protections do they receive?
So cold water lakes that don't meet the threshold, I mean, those would be impaired, and so they would need to be restored. So basically, in most cases, there's two main things that are probably going to cause it. One is cultural eutrophication, the other is climate change. And if it is eutrophication, then there'd be a TMDL, and we need to reduce the amount of phosphorus loading within the system in order to bring it back into alignment with the standard. If it's climate change, there's less we can do other than sort of document the loss of those lakes and at least say, well, this thing used to support Cisco, or whitefish or trout, but they're gone now because the climate is just too warm for them. And maybe they can be restored somewhere down the road. But that goes to some of what Derek was talking about and what Pete Jacobson was also talking about, these refuge lakes. And so there's a subset of these lakes that are going to, even under some sort of unpleasant climate change scenarios, these lakes should still be able to support these fish so that we can really focus our efforts on maintaining good water quality within those lakes, because even as things warm, they should still be able to provide refuge for these species.
Question that I had as I was looking through these is, you guys are potentially looking at a substantial increase in the number of lakes that are not going to be meeting their designated uses, that would be impaired, and thus a lot more work. And so, is there a plan for when these lakes come on that are not meeting their uses? How do you plan to scale up, I suppose, is the question, or prioritize and balance those relative to all of the other lakes that are already not meeting their designated uses?
Well, I would argue that is not going to be a huge uptick in the lakes that are impaired. I mean, a lot of these lakes are in the northern part of the state, which are doing pretty well. There certainly will be, in addition, there'll be a number of probably central region lakes that will be added to it. But I think the biggest effort that needs to be expended on these lakes is protection. And so that's the biggest difference is, now we have lakes that suddenly become much closer to the threshold than they were before under our current framework. So where that comes from, I mean, maybe Derek could talk more about it, or go back to Pete Jacobson's talk, and I think Paul Radomski's talk also, was going into protection. You're going to get more benefit, you're going to get more bang for your buck if you protect these things rather than let them degrade and then try to fix them. And so that's where the effort is going to be ramped up, and that's what we've been doing as we have more money now because of the sales tax in the state, and so we're spending more money on water quality and restoration and protecting watersheds. And so more and more our shift is away from those impaired waters and more to those protection strategies, because I think that's really where we're going to get the most benefit. How the devil's in the details though, and I just make the numbers. I create the problems for people that have to implement them. So I don't know if Derek has anything he wants to chip in on that.
Well, I was just thinking too, for the restoration side of things, at least a proportion of these lakes that would be impaired for cold water species are already impaired just based on the current eutrophication standards. And so, they've undergone work, TMDL studies. We have watershed restoration and protection strategies that look at approaches that can be taken to improve water quality in those watersheds. And so I think that a lot of that would kind of fold into that as well.
Good, thanks. Another question from the audience. Did your assessment of resident populations based on the surveys take into consideration a sustaining population showing a healthy balance of younger fish? So looking at not only the number of fish in the lake, but the condition of that population in terms of a mix of age classes, those sorts of considerations.
It doesn't at this point. That's one of those things where, we're using professional judgment if we have one of those lakes that's kind of on the edge and we have that data available. But a lot of times we don't have, consistent aging data to be able to look at, just because cold water species generally are caught so inconsistently in our standard gill nets. So if we have specific questions about a given lake, then we can circle back to it, either collect more data using vertical gill nets, for example, or kind of dig into things a little bit more deeply.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions in our Q&A function here. This is the last call for questions. And again, I'll take time to say thank you to Will and Derek for their presentation. I see they're putting their contact information up here. So again, thank you guys both. Much appreciated. I know there's a pretty good number of folks that attended, and I know that this is helpful information across the MGLP as folks are looking at implementing similar programs within their own states. So thank you all, and have a good day.